Having lost her position, Dr. Elise Harding found herself standing at the grave of a wealthy man she had been unable to save. She overheard two foreigners speaking nearby and chose to feign ignorance of their language. Elise's spirits were at an all-time low, and for good reason. It wasn't every day that a doctor was fired because a patient passed away after treatment. The department head had been furious, shouting and banging on the desk, threatening to pursue legal action. Meanwhile, the chief physician had been calmer but no less direct. "There's no avoiding termination," Dr. Maynard said bluntly. "But Dr. Maynard, I followed every protocol. The prescribed treatment was safe, and I can provide all the documentation to prove it," Elise replied, her voice trembling as she fought back tears. Dr. Maynard shook his head solemnly. "I don't know how you treated him, Dr. Harding, but the outcome is clear. Prepare for the worst. The police will be coming for your statement, so think carefully before you speak. Now, head to accounting and settle your paperwork." With a heavy heart, Elise nodded and left the office. All she wanted to do was cry. Of all days, why did it have to be the funeral of her former patient, Charles Whitmore? Likely, the service was already over, but she felt compelled to visit the cemetery anyway. Charles had been under her care for a rare blood clotting disorder, and his death had been sudden and mysterious. The speed of events had left her reeling. The autopsy provided no answers, and everyone seemed to assume her guilt. After all, it was under her treatment that the wealthy businessman ended up 6 feet under. Calling for a one-way taxi, Elise stopped to purchase a mourning wreath and a bouquet of carnations, each pair of flowers symbolizing the weight of her sorrow. She spotted Whitmore's grave from afar, its grandeur unmistakable. Piles of wreaths and bouquets adorned the area, along with a large oak cross bearing his photograph and a commemorative plaque. To her surprise, 2 men in black suits lingered near the grave. The funeral must have just concluded. Elise wondered what they were doing there. Perhaps, like her, they had come to pay their final respects. She offered them a polite nod, laid her flowers gently on the grave, and placed the wreath beside them. Bowing her head, Elise tried to focus on her silent grief. Just then, she overheard their conversation in a language she hadn't used in years. By a strange twist of fate, Elise was somewhat fluent in it, enough to understand snippets. "I wonder if she has any clue who she's mourning," said the older man, his tone laced with condescension. "How could she? Just look at her," sneered the younger man, chuckling under his breath. Elise's face burned with embarrassment. Were they mocking her? How dare they laugh and chatter as if they were at a casual gathering instead of a cemetery? "Everything was arranged flawlessly," the older man remarked smugly. "Not a single issue." "Not a hitch," the younger one added with a smirk. Elise knelt by the grave, pretending not to hear. The mingling scents of carnations and damp soil made her feel faint. Behind her, the men finished their conversation and started to leave. With her heart pounding, Elise cast them a glance of disdain before turning her gaze back to the grave. The laughter of strangers was the last thing she needed on a day like this. The foreigners muttered something in hushed tones before walking toward the cemetery gates. Elise Harding glanced over her shoulder, her eyes filled with contempt. Near the entrance, an elderly caretaker emerged from the small guardhouse, waving at her with a warm smile. Elise hesitated, nodding uncertainly. Why did his face seem so familiar? As she considered approaching him, a strange sound stopped her in her tracks. "What was that?" Elise whispered to herself, her body shivering despite the mild evening air. At first, she thought it might be a mourner's cry, a grieving relative overwhelmed by sorrow. But looking around, she saw no one nearby. The sound came again, clearer this time. It wasn't a human voice, it was a faint, muffled moan, and it wasn't coming from the air but from beneath the ground. "Oh my goodness," Elise gasped, her pulse quickening. The sound repeated, this time tinged with unmistakable pain and despair. Her instincts overtook her hesitation. Ignoring the damp soil clinging to her shoes, Elise knelt by the grave and pressed her ear close to the mound. The moaning was real, echoing faintly from the depths of the earth. Elise's heart pounded wildly. "This can't be real," she murmured. But the sound persisted, urgent and filled with anguish. She shot to her feet and sprinted toward the caretaker's hut. "Please help," she shouted, banging on the creaky wooden door. It opened slowly to reveal the caretaker, a frail yet sturdy man dressed in worn boots and a faded jacket. His face bore the lines of a life spent outdoors, and his eyes showed a quiet kindness. "What's wrong, miss?" he asked in a gravelly voice. There's a sound," Elise stammered, unable to keep her voice steady. "I heard a moan. From a fresh grave. Please come quickly." The caretaker's weathered face betrayed no surprise. Over the years, he'd heard his fair share of eerie cemetery stories and often dismissed them. But something about Elise's urgency struck a chord. With a resigned sigh, he grabbed a flashlight and a shovel. "Let's go," he said. As dusk descended, the two stepped into the growing shadows of the cemetery. "Where did you hear it?" the caretaker asked as they walked, his voice oddly familiar to Elise. She couldn't place it, but she couldn't shake the feeling she'd met him before. "This way," Elise said, leading him toward Charles Whitmore's grave. The caretaker followed, his sharp eyes darting nervously through the dim light. When they reached the grave, Elise pointed firmly. "It was here. I heard it. Right here." Without hesitation, the caretaker knelt and pressed his ear to the ground. His face paled, and a flicker of fear crossed his eyes. "Stay back," he said grimly, planting his shovel into the fresh soil. Despite his age, the caretaker worked with surprising speed, digging with focused determination. Elise found a smaller shovel nearby, likely forgotten by the gravediggers, and began helping him, her hands trembling as she scooped away the damp earth. The moaning grew louder, spurring them on. After nearly half an hour of relentless digging, the coffin lid came into view. Its glossy lacquer was cracked, revealing shoddy craftsmanship beneath. "Another cheap trick by the funeral home," the caretaker muttered bitterly. "They've skimped on materials again." The remark triggered a faint memory in Elise, but before she could dwell on it, the caretaker climbed into the grave and pushed the lid aside. Elise held her breath as she peered into the coffin. "Charles?" she whispered, expecting to see her late patient. Instead, a pale man in tattered clothes lay within. His face was gaunt, his lips dry and cracked, but his chest rose and fell faintly. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead, and his lips moved weakly. "Oh my God," the caretaker whispered, his voice quivering. "He's alive." The man in the coffin stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. He propped himself up on one elbow, his movements shaky and uncertain. Where am I?" he croaked, his voice hoarse. His wide eyes scanned his surroundings, landing on Elise and the caretaker. "Am I in a grave? Is this the other side?" Elise crouched down, her hands trembling. "We need to call for help," she said urgently. "He's in shock." The caretaker nodded and helped the man out of the coffin. The stranger, disoriented and weak, clung to the edges of the grave for support. "I don't understand," the man murmured. "How did I get here? What's going on?" "You're safe now," Elise said softly, though her own mind raced with questions. Who was this man? And where was Charles Whitmore? The caretaker froze momentarily, then helped the trembling man climb out of the grave. The stranger's face was pale, his expression filled with confusion and fear. He swayed unsteadily, clutching the edges of the grave as if to anchor himself. "I don't know how I got here," he said, his voice tinged with anxiety. "I was offered a temporary job, some funeral work. I went in for an interview, but everything after that is a blur. My head feels like it's splitting." "What's your name?" the caretaker asked, struggling to mask his concern. "Elliot Marks," the man replied weakly. Elise and the caretaker exchanged stunned glances. They were standing at the grave that should have contained the body of a prominent businessman, yet here was a stranger, alive and bewildered. "How did this happen?" Elise asked, her voice quaking. "Did you know Charles Whitmore?" "No," Elliot said, shaking his head. "I've never even heard of him." He paused, trying to piece together fragmented memories. "Wait. I remember now. They asked me to fill in for some gravediggers at the funeral. I agreed because I needed the money. But the last thing I recall is a coffin on a pedestal then. Nothing. What could have happened to him?" Elise murmured, unable to find any logical explanation. The caretaker switched on his flashlight and began scanning the area, his furrowed brow deepening. Elise looked at him more closely, and suddenly a wave of recognition washed over her. "You're Mr. Calloway," she whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "My high school language teacher." The caretaker turned and gave a soft, knowing smile. "It's me, Elise. You finally remembered." Tears welled in Elise's eyes as she took in the familiar yet aged face. Mr. Calloway had been her favorite teacher, the one who had sparked her love for languages and bolstered her confidence when she doubted herself. "You haven't changed a bit," he said warmly. "But as for me, I've aged and thinned out. I went from a classroom to a cemetery. Life is full of surprises." "I can't believe it's you," Elise said, feeling a mix of guilt and nostalgia. "I should have visited you long ago. After graduation, we all just disappeared." Mr. Calloway waved dismissively. "Don't trouble yourself over the past. Right now, we need to figure out what to do about him," he said, nodding toward Elliot, who was pacing nervously near the grave. Elise approached Elliot, gently taking his hand. "Don't worry," she said soothingly. "We'll sort this out. Let's call an ambulance to make sure you're okay." But Elliot pulled his hand away, shaking his head. "No ambulance," he said firmly. "No police either. I don't even know what's happening, but I'm certain I don't want to get tangled up with the authorities. What if I've been set up for something?" Sensing his growing distress, Mr. Calloway stepped in. "Let's take it one step at a time. Come back to my place for now. You need rest and water, and we can figure things out from there." Elliot hesitated, then nodded slowly. His empty gaze betrayed his lingering fear and confusion. Elise lingered at the grave, pulling out her phone to document the scene. She captured the cracked coffin lid, the empty burial site, and every detail connected to Charles Whitmore, the ornate cross, the engraved plaque, and the wreaths with their mourning ribbons. Once she was satisfied with the photos, she helped Mr. Calloway return the grave to its original state, covering it as if nothing had been disturbed. "Ever since I graduated med school, I've been working non-stop," Elise said quietly as they worked. "I should have reached out to you sooner, Mr. Calloway. You were always such an important part of my life." Her former teacher gave her a kind smile. "You don't owe me anything, Elise. You've made something of yourself, and I've always been proud of you. Now, let's focus on helping this young man. This is unlike anything I've ever seen." Back at the caretaker's lodge, Mr. Calloway offered Elliot a simple meal and a cot to rest on. "Stay here for now," he told him. "We'll leave the grave as it was. Whoever orchestrated this clearly wanted it buried. Literally." Elliot nodded, though his eyes remained distant, as if haunted by questions he couldn't yet articulate. As they settled in for the night, Elise couldn't shake the eerie feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger mystery. Mr. Calloway nodded wistfully. "I've thought about you often, Elise. You were one of my brightest students. I always knew you'd make something of yourself, whether as a talented translator or a brilliant doctor. I'm proud of you." After finishing their work on the grave, the two sat at a weathered wooden table near the caretaker's lodge. The approaching twilight cast long shadows across the cemetery, but Elise felt no unease. Instead, she listened intently as Mr. Calloway shared his story, one laden with sorrow. He revealed that his only son had died in a tragic car accident years ago. After the loss, his daughter-in-law, with whom he'd never had a close relationship, had driven him out of their home. She forbade him from seeing his grandchildren, and he'd been living a solitary life in the caretaker's lodge ever since. Elise's heart ached as she heard the story. How could she be so cruel? Why would she treat you like this? "I think she's afraid I'll take the children away," Mr. Calloway said bitterly. Elise considered his words. His daughter-in-law likely felt overwhelmed and insecure, struggling to maintain control over her life. Still, her actions seemed heartless. "You have to fight for your rights," Elise said, her voice firm. "You have every right to see your grandchildren, and they have the right to know their grandfather." Mr. Calloway shook his head. "It's easier said than done. Lawyers are expensive, and I can't afford the good ones. The rest, they're just out to profit off someone's pain." "Don't worry," Elise said confidently. "I'll figure something out. I don't know how yet, but I will." The elderly man's eyes glistened with gratitude. "You're a blessing, Elise. I can't thank you enough." "There's no need to thank me," Elise replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "You were my favorite teacher. It's an honor to help you." She hugged him tightly, the bond between teacher and student deepening as they shared this moment. It transcended time and circumstance, uniting them in a chance encounter neither could have anticipated. As night fell, the three of them returned to the lodge. Mr. Calloway brewed a pot of fragrant tea and regaled Elise and Elliot with a few amusing stories from his teaching days. For a while, laughter filled the small room, even lifting Elise's spirits. Elliot, however, remained quiet, lost in thought. He still couldn't make sense of how he'd ended up in someone else's grave, or why his head throbbed with pain. And where was Charles Whitmore? Elise recounted the unsettling encounter with the foreigners at the cemetery. When she translated the phrases she'd overheard, Mr. Calloway praised her fluency, a testament to her skills as his former student. But his expression soon grew serious. "What happened today goes far beyond the ordinary," he said, his voice low. The hours slipped by unnoticed, and when Elise finally prepared to leave, a pang of worry struck her. "Elliot," she asked gently, "do you have somewhere to go? A place to rest and recover?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Not really. I came here from a small town for work, but like so many others, I got scammed. They didn't pay me, took my passport, and threatened me. They said if I caused trouble, they'd dump me in the river. I haven't been home in years. I left after a fight with my parents, and I can't go back like this. Not as a failure." "You shouldn't turn your back on your parents," Mr. Calloway said with gentle reproach. "They gave you life." Elliot nodded, his expression somber. "I know. But it's hard. I even had plans to marry once, before I joined the army. My fiancée didn't wait for me. She married someone else, a farmer's son better off than me. I can't blame her. But when she wrote to say she was getting married, I almost—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "Let's just say my friend saved me from doing something stupid. After that, I couldn't bear to go home. When I came back from the army, she'd already had a baby." His story trailed off, heavy with regret. Elise's heart went out to him. Despite his mistakes, his pain was clear. "I don't have much to offer," Mr. Calloway said, "but you can stay here as long as you need. It'll be good to have company, and there's always work to be done around the cemetery." Elliot managed a faint smile, his first of the evening. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Elise, too, felt a sense of relief. She wasn't ready to leave the situation unresolved, but for now, she knew Elliot was in good hands. Mr. Calloway and Elise exchanged a knowing glance. The young man's pain and determination were palpable. "So what's next?" Elise asked gently. "Will you come with me? The taxi is on its way." Elliot shook his head. "No, I'll stay here with Mr. Calloway for now. I need time to recover and figure out my next steps. Besides, there's always work at the cemetery. I won't go hungry." The elderly caretaker's face lit up with a smile. "That's a good idea, son. It'll be nice to have company around here. Beats spending every night alone, dreaming of graves and shadows." Elise smiled as well, then stood to leave. "All right, I wrote my number down and left it on the table. If you need anything, call me. I'll check in on you in a few days. Take care, both of you." "Of course," Mr. Calloway replied, pulling her into a warm hug. As Elise approached the gate, she turned and waved at the two men. They waved back, their expressions a mix of gratitude and fondness. Stepping into the waiting taxi, Elise felt a deep sense of love and admiration for her former teacher, who had unexpectedly become a mentor and friend once again. She noticed a distinctive emblem on the windshield, sparking a sudden wave of compassion. The taxi driver was a double amputee, evident from the vehicle's adaptive controls. As he smoothly pulled away, Elise gave him her address and leaned back into the seat, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The car's interior was bathed in a soft glow from the dashboard, and the quiet hum of the engine blended with the occasional whoosh of passing traffic. Elise stared out the window at the hazy cityscape, her thoughts swirling in tandem with the foggy night. "I must be the worst passenger," Elise said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I haven't said a word." The driver smiled warmly, and Elise immediately recognized it as genuine. "Not at all," he said. "You seem like you've had a rough day. Everything all right?" Elise hesitated, then nodded. Well, I lost my job today, and I spent the rest of the day at the cemetery. Let's just say it's been overwhelming." The driver didn't reply right away. Instead, he turned on soft, calming music, transforming the car into a cozy sanctuary. "I'm Alex," he said after a moment, glancing at her briefly. "What's your name?" "Elise," she replied. "And yeah, it's been a long day, but that's part of the job, I guess." "You're a doctor, aren't you?" Alex asked, surprising her. Elise blinked. "Yes, how did you know?" He smiled knowingly. Your hands, they're well cared for, no calluses or tan lines, which means you're indoors a lot. Plus, there's a faint smell of antiseptics on your clothes. Pretty simple deduction. Elise coughed awkwardly, both impressed and flustered. I suppose I could have been a nurse or something else in healthcare. Why guess a doctor? Alex shrugged with a grin. It's in your posture, confidence, even though you're clearly drained. Doctors have a certain way of carrying themselves. His perceptiveness intrigued Elise. She watched him for a moment, noting how effortlessly he maneuvered the car despite his disability. Were you always a taxi driver? Elise asked, then hesitated. I mean before. Before I lost my legs? Alex finished for her, his tone neutral. No, I was in law enforcement. During a high-stakes arrest, things went sideways. Let's just say I'm lucky to be alive. Elise saw the shadow of a painful memory flicker across his face. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have brought it up. Alex waved off her concern. It's all right, I've made my peace with it. I may not be chasing criminals anymore, but I still help people in my own way. That's enough for me. His words resonated with Elise, who found herself admiring his resilience. You're a strong person, she said softly. It's inspiring. Alex pulled up to her building and turned to her with a small smile. Thanks, Elise. Keep your chin up. Whatever you're going through, I can tell you'll come out stronger on the other side. Elise returned the smile, feeling lighter for the first time that day. Thank you, Alex. Keep the change. It's my small way of saying thanks for the ride. She stepped out of the car and watched as Alex drove off into the misty night. Taking a deep breath, Elise headed inside, ready to finally rest after an unforgettable day with. He paused before continuing, his voice steadier. It was 7 years ago. The guy we were after turned out to be an old classmate of mine. I pitied him, but he didn't pity me. He rammed my car during the chase and sped onto the highway. They caught him eventually, but it took the team an hour to cut me out of the wreckage. Elise looked at him, her respect growing. You're an incredibly strong person, she said earnestly. I'm sure your life still has purpose. Don't give up. Alex nodded, a determined glint in his eyes. I won't. I'm saving up for prosthetics, the advanced kind. Once I get them, I'll join a sports club, maybe even compete in events for people with disabilities. His resolve brought a smile to Elise's face. Goodbye, Alex, she said as the car pulled up to her building. Thank you for the ride, and here, keep the change. Let it be a little contribution to your dream. Goodbye, Elise, Alex replied warmly. Take care. Here's my card, just in case you ever need it. Taking a deep breath of the crisp night air, Elise walked toward her apartment. Her mind buzzed with thoughts of Alex's strength and resilience, as well as the strange events of the day. For now, though, all she wanted was a long bath and some much-needed sleep. Elise's apartment was modest, a small, one-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood. It was all she could afford after her divorce, which had left her with little more than a fraction of what she'd worked for. Her ex-husband, Daniel, had taken the 4-bedroom apartment in an upscale district, leaving Elise with barely enough to scrape together a down payment for her current place. Daniel had considered the settlement fair, and his high-powered lawyers had ensured Elise couldn't prove her financial contributions to their former home. But at the time, Elise had been too overwhelmed to fight. A month before the divorce was finalized, Elise had suffered a miscarriage, a devastating blow that left her emotionally drained. She'd even caught herself thinking that if she hadn't lost the baby, she might have been able to save her marriage. But fate had other plans. What Elise hadn't known was that Daniel had already moved on. For months, he'd been having an affair with his secretary, Julia, who wasted no time securing her position by becoming pregnant. The betrayal stung, but Elise didn't harbor resentment. If Julia could have the child that Elise couldn't, then perhaps it was better this way. After learning about the baby, Elise even sent a courier with a few sets of baby clothes as a gesture of goodwill. She never heard back from Daniel or Julia, but it didn't matter. She'd let them live their lives, free of bitterness. That night, after a hot bath, Elise collapsed into bed, too exhausted to even think about dinner. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless. Her mind replayed the events of the day like a broken record, the grave, the moans, and the stranger named Elliot. Elise Harding tossed and turned, her dreams haunted by the cracked lid of a coffin and the muffled moans she had heard that day. What if they hadn't reached Elliot Marks in time? What if he had suffocated in the grave, trapped and alone? The thought was unbearable. There were so many intricacies to the situation, so many coincidences, that Elise couldn't help but think of divine intervention. She wasn't an atheist. She believed there were forces in the world that humans couldn't fully understand. And what had transpired at the cemetery was nothing short of a miracle. Her restless dreams shifted to images of hospital wards filled with patients, all seeking her help. Interspersed were visions of foreign words written in Gothic script, swirling like a riddle she couldn't solve. Who were the foreigners she had encountered at the cemetery? Why had they behaved so strangely? And where had Charles Whitmore disappeared to? Elise woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of that surreal day. Then, as if from nowhere, the image of Charles resurfaced in her mind. Charles Whitmore, her enigmatic patient from the hematology department. A wealthy businessman with a commanding presence, he was unlike the other affluent patients she had treated. Something about him had always seemed off, even from the moment he arrived. Elise remembered how vague and inconsistent his symptoms had been. Headaches, abdominal cramps, shortness of breath. The tests had all come back normal, showing no underlying health issues. And yet, he insisted he was gravely ill. His story about a hereditary curse affecting the men in his family, a supposed condition that caused severe blood clotting issues, had seemed almost laughable. Charles claimed his father and grandfather had suffered from the same mysterious ailment, but there was no medical evidence to support his claims. Adding to Elise's doubts were Charles's appearance and demeanor. His tailored suits, exclusive cologne, and expensive gadgets didn't align with the image of a man battling a life-threatening illness. As days turned into weeks, Elise grew more certain that Charles was faking his condition. But why? Was he simply seeking attention, or was there something deeper at play? Driven by her suspicions, Elise conducted a quiet investigation. It wasn't a grand detective endeavor, just a few discreet conversations here and there. She tapped into her network of colleagues, fellow doctors, and even a few hospital staff. What she uncovered shocked her. Charles was deeply in debt to dangerous people. His extravagant lifestyle had been funded by loans from less than reputable sources, and his creditors were closing in. Elise realized his supposed illness might be a ploy to evade these creditors. By feigning a serious condition, he could hide in the safety of the hospital, shielded from their reach. A moral dilemma gripped her. Should she report her suspicions to the hospital administration? On the one hand, Charles's actions were deceitful, drawing attention and resources away from patients who genuinely needed care. On the other hand, the hospital's department head had personally approved Charles's stay in a private room, complete with luxury amenities. Ultimately, Elise couldn't remain silent. One evening during her rounds, she confronted Charles directly. "Charles," she said firmly, her voice steady but her eyes sharp. "I know you're lying about your illness." For a moment, his confident facade crumbled. His face drained of color and fear flickered in his eyes. But just as quickly, his expression shifted, replaced by a cunning gleam. "You think you figured me out, Dr. Harding?" he said, his tone smug. "Let me guess, you're going to expose me?" "Not me," Elise replied calmly. "I'll leave that to the hospital management." That same evening, she submitted her findings to the administration. The next day, Charles was discharged, his supposed cure celebrated. But for Elise, the case was far from over. Despite her actions, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Charles's lies ran deeper than anyone realized. And now, with his grave empty and a stranger occupying it, the mystery only seemed to be growing. Charles Whitmore was discharged the next day, supposedly cured. Elise Harding felt a flicker of satisfaction. Justice had prevailed. She had exposed a fraud and defended the integrity of her hospital, ensuring resources would go to patients who truly needed them. But her relief was short-lived. Not long after his discharge, Charles died suddenly. The hospital administration, led by the department head and chief physician, quickly pinned the blame on Elise. She tried to argue her case, citing his clean bill of health at the time of discharge and the lack of any legitimate medical issues. But her protests fell on deaf ears. No one cared that Charles had manipulated everyone around him in the days leading up to his death. No one considered how his lies had diverted attention from patients who genuinely needed care. Instead, whispers spread through the hospital corridors. Elise had discharged the patient too soon. Some even speculated that her actions triggered some mysterious, irreversible condition. For heaven's sake, Elise muttered bitterly to herself. He was healthy enough to eat gourmet meals 3 times a day. Does that sound like a dying man? She had tried to defend herself, but the hospital's administration was immovable. "It's no longer your concern, Dr. Harding," said Dr. Lennox, the department head. "You'd better hope this doesn't end up in court. If it does, you might lose your medical license for life." He offered her a janitorial position as a parting gesture, a cruel reminder of how little they valued her contributions. Elise left his office in tears, slamming the door behind her. How could they treat her like this? And why had Charles died? Even stranger, where was his body now? Dawn broke, painting the room in soft light. The warmth of the morning sun brought Elise a sense of calm. She had done the right thing, she knew it deep down. No matter what the hospital claimed, she would remain guided by honesty and compassion. Answers would come in time, she just had to wait. Meanwhile, Elliot Marks had spent the night at the cemetery caretaker's lodge. He awoke feeling rested for the first time in days. Mr. Calloway, true to his nature, didn't pry into Elliot's past or demand answers. He simply offered shelter, food, and the reassurance that Elliot could stay as long as he needed. The morning greeted them with a thick fog, cloaking the cemetery in a ghostly gray haze. Mr. Calloway stepped out of the lodge, feeling the damp chill seep into his shirt. "Good morning, Elliot," he called, noticing the younger man stepping out into the yard. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," Elliot replied, his voice brighter than before. "Not the best weather, though." The caretaker chuckled. "It'll clear up by lunchtime, I think. You're looking better already. Make sure you eat plenty. You'll need your strength." Elliot nodded, retreating inside while Mr. Calloway began his rounds. The caretaker walked the cemetery's paths with practiced familiarity. He stopped to clear fallen leaves from memorials, dust off neglected headstones, and pull weeds from graves that hadn't been visited in years. For Mr. Calloway, the cemetery felt like home, a place of peace and solitude, even if it was occasionally too quiet. Suddenly, the stillness was broken by the sound of sobbing. The caretaker paused, listening intently. The cries seemed to come from behind a pair of birch trees near a freshly filled grave. Curious, Mr. Calloway approached and saw a young boy, no older than 6, kneeling beside the grave. His pants were dirty, and his sweater was worn. In his hands, he clutched a small child's shovel, using it to dig at the earth with trembling determination. The boy's face was streaked with tears, his eyes red from crying. "Good morning, little one," Mr. Calloway said gently, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Calloway asked gently, his voice calm and soothing. "And why are you crying?" The boy flinched, startled by the caretaker's presence. His small hands released the shovel, which dropped to the ground with a soft thud. "I want to see my mom," the boy whispered, his tear-streaked face gazing at the grave adorned with withered flowers. Mr. Calloway knelt beside him, his heart aching. It was clear the boy had come to say goodbye to his mother. "Your mom is in a better place now," the caretaker said softly, "where there's no sadness, no pain." "I know," the boy murmured, wiping the dirt and tears from his cheeks, "but I really want to see her. What if she's cold or hungry? I brought her this." He held up a small, crumpled bun, clutching it tightly in his little hands. Mr. Calloway crouched further, his eyes filled with compassion. "Well," he said, "you can leave it for her, something she'll surely enjoy wherever she is." "But it's all I have," the boy cried, his voice trembling. The caretaker looked at the child, his sympathy deepening. "Then leave it," he said gently. "Your mom already knows how much you love her." The boy hesitated, then carefully took the bun from his pocket. He turned it over in his hands, pressing it to his chest as if to imbue it with all his love. Finally, he placed it reverently at the foot of the cross marking the grave. Leaning in close to the photograph on the grave, he kissed it and whispered, "Mommy, I love you so much." Mr. Calloway watched, his chest tightening with emotion. Seeing such a tender display of devotion from one so young made him realize how deeply the boy missed his mother. "What's your name, son?" he asked as the boy stood up. Nathan, the boy replied, wiping his face with the sleeve of his worn sweater. Come with me, Nathan, Mr. Calloway said, standing and offering his hand. I'll take you home. Nathan took the caretaker's hand and followed him, glancing back one last time at the grave. Where are we going? He asked hesitantly. I don't know, Nathan admitted. I live with my stepfather, but he's drinking again. There's no one else. Don't worry, Mr. Calloway reassured him. You can stay with me and Elliot for now. You'll be safe here. Nathan looked up at him with a mix of gratitude and relief. Holding tightly to Mr. Calloway's hand, he whispered toward the grave, Mommy, don't worry. I'll come visit you often. Your mom will never forget you, the caretaker said with a warm smile. She'll always be with you, right here. He placed a hand over the boy's heart. After a few moments of silence, the three of them walked back to the lodge. Elliot, seeing Nathan for the first time, looked surprised. This is Nathan, Mr. Calloway explained. He needs a place to stay. Elliot crouched down to meet the boy's gaze and immediately noticed the sadness in his eyes. Don't worry, he said softly. You're not alone anymore. Nathan managed a small smile, the first sign of light breaking through his grief. Thank you, he whispered. Mr. Calloway felt a tear slip down his cheek as he observed the two. His quiet, solitary life had been unexpectedly enriched by his new companions. The caretaker prepared a simple breakfast, sandwiches and tea, for Nathan and Elliot. As the boy ate, Mr. Calloway turned on his old radio to listen to the morning news, its soft hum filling the room. Meanwhile, Elise Harding sat in her kitchen, cradling a mug of strong coffee. She felt paralyzed by indecision. Should she go to the police? But what would she say? That she had heard moans from a grave, only to find someone else buried inside? Elliot had strongly requested she avoid involving the authorities, and Elise didn't want to betray his trust. But she couldn't ignore the strange events unfolding around her. Then, her thoughts shifted to Alex, the perceptive taxi driver she had met just the day before. His background in law enforcement might provide her with the insight she needed. Pulling out the business card he had given her, she dialed the number. Alex answered almost immediately, as though he had been waiting for her call. After listening to Elise's hesitant recounting of the cemetery events, Alex spoke decisively. Wait for me, he said. I'll meet you at the square in front of your building. Hearing the determination in his voice, Elise felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, with Alex's help, she could finally start making sense of the chaos. I'll be there soon, Alex said over the phone, his tones steady with confidence and determination. It caught Elise Harding slightly off guard. When she met him in person, Alex listened to her recounting of the strange events at the cemetery without interruption. His expression reflected not just compassion, but also a quiet understanding that seemed rooted in personal experience. This Charles Whitmore, Alex said finally. He's a wealthy man, right? Elise nodded. Yes, a prominent businessman. His name has come up in more than a few scandals. And now, someone else was nearly buried in his grave. She hesitated. I'm not sure if you can help, but I had to tell someone. Alex studied her for a moment before shaking his head. He saw the worry she couldn't quite conceal. I can try to find Charles, he said at last. Elise's breath hitched. You really think you can? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Well, in this world nothing's ever certain, Alex replied. But I'll do my best. He stood, leaning slightly on his prosthetic leg. Trust didn't come easily to him these days, but Elise had a way of seeing him not as someone defined by his disability, but as a capable person. I'll start looking, he said, but I have a feeling this story won't end neatly. Elise nodded, her eyes brimming with hope. Thank you, Alex, she said softly, watching as he headed back to his car. Alex returned to his small apartment, his mind already working through possible leads. Among his old possessions, he found the keys to an office he hadn't used in years. It had been home to the detective agency he once ran with his best friend, Vincent. Dialing Vincent's number, Alex felt a twinge of doubt. Would his friend even pick up after all this time? The call connected, and Vincent's familiar voice came through. Alex? Well, this is a surprise. What's going on? Did the world end and no one told me? Alex chuckled despite himself. I need your help, Vin. It's urgent. All right, spill. What's got you calling out of the blue? Alex explained everything Elise had told him about Charles Whitmore, the empty grave, and the mysterious events surrounding it. Vincent let out a low whistle. You know I've left the detective business, Alex. But for you, I'll make an exception. I might have a few connections in some less than savory circles. They could tell us where he disappeared to. Alex exhaled in relief. Thanks, Vin. I owe you one. Feeling more confident, Alex dug through his old files and found a notebook containing contact details for one of his former informants. He made the call. Hey, old man, Alex began. Still in the game? What do you want, Alex? Came the gruff reply. I need some intel. It's about Charles Whitmore, the businessman. Do you know where he is, or what happened to him? There was a long pause on the other end of the line before the informant spoke. I'll see what I can find. You're still calling in that favor from years ago, huh? Exactly, Alex said. Let's see if you can deliver. As Alex cast his net into the murky waters of crime, days turned into weeks. While waiting for leads, Elise visited the cemetery several times, spending time with Mr. Calloway and Elliot. She also got to know young Nathan, the boy Mr. Calloway had taken in. Nathan's story weighed heavily on Elise's heart. The more she got to know the boy, the more determined she became to help him. Maybe I should adopt him, Elise thought one evening, her heart swelling with emotion. Oh God, he's such a sweet child. When else will I get a chance to be a mother? And will I ever have a child of my own? She couldn't shake the thought. Time wasn't on her side, and Nathan's presence felt like a gift she didn't want to lose. When Elise shared her idea with Mr. Calloway, his face lit up. That's a wonderful idea, he said. Nathan is a good kid, mark my words, he won't let you down. I've started spending more time with him, and I can tell you, he's got incredible potential, even if he doesn't know it yet. Elise smiled, her heart swelling as she watched Nathan play nearby. Meanwhile, Alex was immersed in his work, piecing together fragments of information from his contacts. The more he learned, the more he realized just how tangled the web surrounding Charles Whitmore truly was. Alex pored over every lead he could find about Charles Whitmore, tracing his name across news reports, financial records, and shady dealings. He met with Vincent again, who handed him contacts deep in the city's underworld. Just tread carefully, Vincent warned. These people don't like prying eyes. With that in mind, Alex made his way to one of the most troubled neighborhoods in the city. There, in a nondescript office, he met with a man reputed to have connections in all the wrong places. The man listened to Alex's request with a patient yet piercing gaze. When Alex finished, the informant leaned back in his chair and smirked. You really want to know what happened to Whitmore? It's simple, the man said, his tone mocking. The guy owed more money than you can imagine. His creditors were closing in, so he staged his own death to disappear. He had help, big players abroad. They set him up with everything he needed, including a fake funeral. Alex frowned, skepticism creeping into his voice. And that's all? The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You want more, don't you? Fine. Whitmore didn't just run for no reason. He had someone waiting for him, his father, a wealthy tycoon with enormous assets. Turns out the old man had been hiding overseas since the late 90s to escape some heavy competition. When his wife died in a car accident, he left their son, a 1-year-old Charles, in an orphanage. He had no choice. The informant paused for dramatic effect before continuing. After all these years, the old man finally found his son, so he sent a team to get him. Everything, the fake death, the empty coffin, the whole charade, was orchestrated to bring Whitmore to his father. Alex stood there, stunned by the revelation. His prosthetic leg felt heavier as he struggled to process the information. Where is Charles now? He finally asked. The man chuckled darkly. Do you really think I'd tell you that? You don't think I'd just hand you his location on a silver platter, do you? Realizing he'd hit a dead end, Alex sighed and turned to leave. Thanks for the info anyway. Don't mention it, the man replied with a smirk. But here's some advice. Forget about Whitmore. He's not worth losing your life over. Alex returned home with a heavy heart, his frustration mounting. He had learned the truth, but it wasn't enough to take any actionable steps. That evening, he called Elise to share what he had uncovered. When Elise heard the story, she was floored. He fled abroad to meet his father and staged all of this to get away? Alex's voice was steady but somber. That's what it looks like. "I'm sorry, Elise, but it sounds like this trail is going cold." To say Elise was shocked was an understatement. Every thread that might have helped her reclaim her career and clear her name had been severed. Without Whitmore, there was no way to prove her innocence. To everyone else, she remained the doctor who had failed her patient. Her dreams of returning to the medical field seemed crushed. The best she could hope for now was a low-level position, possibly as a nurse in a reception area. Years of studying, interning, and striving to make a difference in people's lives had been wiped away by the actions of a single man. And Charles Whitmore? He had simply sailed away into a new life, leaving chaos in his wake. The thought of it made Elise feel sick. Ethan Marks had been an innocent pawn in Whitmore's scheme, nearly killed by the funeral team's actions. Who would compensate him for the potential long-term effects of being buried alive? Certainly not Charles, who was now basking in the wealth of his estranged father. Elise's mind spun with anger and frustration. A homeless man like Ethan, with no family and no safety net, had been used and discarded. He was a man society had written off long ago. The only thing keeping Elise from falling into despair was Nathan, the little boy Mr. Calloway had taken in. His bright smile and innocent hope anchored her. "I can't give up," Elise whispered to herself, determination hardening in her chest. Not now. She resolved to focus on Nathan. Gathering her strength, she began the process of sorting out the necessary paperwork to become his guardian. If nothing else, Nathan could have the future he deserved, and Elise could find purpose in helping him grow into the person his mother would have been proud of. "And then we'll see who comes out on top," Elise Harding whispered to herself, as though casting a spell. It took her nearly a month to gather the required paperwork and prepare for court. She would have preferred to avoid such a process, but Nathan's stepfather, Marcus, stubbornly refused to relinquish custody of the boy. Finally, the day of truth arrived. Sunlight poured through the blinds of Elise's small apartment, illuminating the stack of legal documents spread across her desk. She rubbed her tired eyes, her face a mixture of determination and worry. Today, everything would be decided. Nathan had lost his mother not long ago, leaving him in the care of Marcus, a man Elise knew all too well. Marcus was an alcoholic. She had seen him drunk on numerous occasions, shouting obscenities and lashing out in fits of rage. The thought of leaving Nathan in such an environment was unbearable. Elise had first met Nathan at the cemetery caretaker's lodge, where he sought refuge. Hearing his story, she couldn't turn her back. Nathan had confided in her about his mother's long illness and how Marcus would drink instead of caring for him. Marcus, of course, arrived at court with a carefully rehearsed performance. He played the part of a loving stepfather, speaking about how much he adored Nathan and how he only wanted the best for the boy. He claimed that even when drunk, he had never harmed Nathan. But Elise knew the truth. She had seen Nathan's broken toys and heard his quiet tap frightened whispers. In court, Elise presented her case, armed with evidence of Marcus's neglect and her vision for Nathan's future. She spoke passionately, not just about the documents she had gathered, but from her heart. "I want Nathan to have the kind of life every child deserves," she told the court. "A life filled with love, stability, and opportunity. I've grown to love him like my own, and I will do everything in my power to give him a happy home." Nathan's words played in her mind, the little voice that had once tugged at her heart. "I want to live with Annalise. She's kind." Marcus, on the other hand, descended into bitterness. He hurled accusations at Elise, calling her greedy and claiming she wanted Nathan to serve her interests. He shouted that guardianship would rob Nathan of his freedom, twisting the narrative in his favor. But his anger and malice only highlighted the contrast between the two. Elise's sincerity and love were evident to everyone present. Fortunately, the judge saw through Marcus's act. After hearing both sides, the court ruled in Elise's favor. Marcus's guardianship rights were revoked, and custody of Nathan was officially granted to Elise. The decision filled her with an overwhelming mix of joy and relief. On that same day, Elise brought Nathan home. She bought him new toys, made his favorite meal, macaroni and cheese with meatballs, and filled her apartment with warmth and laughter. Nathan, now smiling brightly, called her Mom for the first time. Elise's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of happiness. She realized all the struggles and sleepless nights had been worth it. Her efforts had given Nathan a home, a real home. She silently promised everyone who had supported her, from Alex and Elliot to Mr. Calloway, that she would dedicate herself to giving Nathan a bright future. Nathan, in turn, brought light into Elise's life. He became the heart of her home, a source of joy that filled her days with purpose. She made plans to show him all the wonders the city had to offer, build sandcastles with him at the beach, explore museums, and read him every fairy tale she could find. One day, while they were walking in the park, Nathan saw a group of children playing nearby. He turned to Elise with a solemn expression. "You won't ever send me back to that man, will you?" he asked. Elise knelt down, pulling him into a hug. "Never, Nathan. You are my family. I'll always be by your side, no matter what." As she spoke, Marcus's words from the courtroom echoed in her mind. His accusations about what it meant to be a parent had been empty, born from bitterness and selfishness. But Elise understood now what Marcus never could. Parenthood wasn't about control or power. It was about love. It was about giving everything to ensure the happiness and well-being of a child. For the first time in a long while, Elise felt a deep sense of peace. She and Nathan had both found what they were searching for, a family. Elise's life, however, was beginning to regain a sense of balance. She remained in touch with Alex and Elliot, both of whom were finding their own paths to healing. Elliot, with Mr. Calloway's encouragement, had taken over as the cemetery caretaker. He had pulled himself together, restored his identification documents, and, in an emotional reunion, reconciled with his parents. They had long believed their son was dead, but their joy at his return brought them closer than ever. This turn of events came shortly after Mr. Calloway retired due to health reasons. Even he found peace, reconciling with his estranged daughter-in-law and being welcomed back into his grandchildren's lives. Elliot quickly proved himself a capable and resourceful manager of the cemetery, handling the responsibilities with dedication and care. As for Elise, her bond with Alex grew stronger every day. With his help, along with photographic evidence proving the empty coffin in Charles Whitmore's grave, Elise successfully cleared her name. The hospital administration, unable to deny the truth any longer, issued a formal apology. The department head and chief physician publicly acknowledged their mistake, restoring Elise's professional reputation and confidence. Encouraged by Elise, Alex joined a program for experimental bionic prosthetics designed to revolutionize mobility for people with disabilities. He volunteered as one of the first participants, working closely with developers to refine the technology. Meanwhile, there was no news of Charles Whitmore for nearly 6 months. Then, unexpectedly, he returned to the country under extraordinary circumstances. The controversial businessman didn't come alone. He was escorted by 2 athletic foreigners who delivered him to the nearest police station. It turned out that Whitmore's elaborate escape plan had fallen apart. The relationship between him and his wealthy, long-lost father, Harold Winthrop, had unraveled due to unforeseen complications. Some speculated it was due to Whitmore's scheming, while others chalked it up to coincidence. Regardless, Harold Winthrop's search for his heir continued, funded by vast resources and extensive efforts. Harold, a tycoon in his twilight years, had mobilized his aides to locate the son he had lost decades ago. The search spanned orphanages, hospitals, and international blood donation centers, uncovering long-forgotten archives. His efforts also funded the renovation of schools and orphanages, equipping them with libraries, computer labs, and gyms. Unbeknownst to Harold, his quest brought benefits to countless children. 6 months later, the unthinkable happened. A nearly perfect DNA match surfaced, leading Harold to an unexpected discovery. His son was not Charles Whitmore, but Alex, the taxi driver with a background in law enforcement. At first, the revelation seemed impossible to believe. Memories of Whitmore's fraudulent claim made everyone skeptical. But after a second DNA test confirmed a 99.9% match, the truth was undeniable. Alex, standing on his newly acquired bionic prosthetics, stared at Harold in disbelief. He struggled to comprehend that he, a man who had grown up in an orphanage fighting for scraps, was the heir to a fortune. "This can't be real," Alex murmured, blinking rapidly as though the moment might vanish. But it was real. Harold, visibly emotional, approached him. "Forgive me, son, for finding you so late," he whispered. Alex shook his head, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "There's nothing to forgive." Turning to Elise, who stood beside him with Nathan in tow, Alex introduced them proudly. "This is my family, my fiancée Elise, and my son, Nathan." Technically, Alex and Elise weren't married yet, but it didn't matter. They were bound by love, their hearts two halves of the same whole. Harold, overjoyed, immediately began planning a grand wedding for his son and future daughter-in-law. Elise, smiling through tears, announced that she was pregnant, completing the circle of their newfound family. In that moment, Alex's journey, from orphan to law enforcement officer to a man wronged by fate and finally to the son of a millionaire, seemed to make sense. He had found not just a father, but a new beginning, surrounded by the people he loved. And for Elise, Nathan, and Alex, the future held nothing but promise.